Chapter 29. When the call came, Gwendraeth James was still at home. He'd been thinking about using up some of his overdue leave and taking the morning off. He'd even brought out a tin of emulsion and a roller kit from the old pantry where they'd lain since Sheila had left him. He was on his second cup of coffee and was deciding whether to throw the paint out and replace it with another colour, or just touch up where the new cabinets were now standing on the worktop, waiting to be screwed in. Either way, if Sheila saw what he'd done, she would accuse him of a lack of imagination, and she'd probably be right. He couldn't really care about paint colours. That was the problem. He couldn't really care about them the way he cared about Parker Merriam, and who had killed him, for example. What was it that Anne Davis had said about him? At bottom, you're probably nothing but cop. She was similar to Sheila in what she thought about him. She's about the same age as well. She'd been brought up in the next town, and part of her knew about men like him even before she'd met him, like he knew about her. His mobile rang while he was thinking about screwing the cabinets finally in place and touching up the paint where the gaps were. He was actually trying to drive the Parker Merriam case out of his mind. It looked less and less like a suicide, an accident, or a random killing, which meant there was a motivation that went deep. He just hadn't found it yet, and it bothered him. The phone beat out its familiar rhythm. Maybe he was being unimaginative there too. Maybe he just changed it for some of little Walter's signature harmonica. He picked it up and answered. Chief? It was Harry Warden. No, it's Magic Sam. Come off it, Chief. This is no time for amusement. This is serious, this is. What is exactly? Then, when Warden told him that there was a report that a body had been found in the drawing room of Plas Wern Las, Gwendraeth cancelled his DIY plans. Didn't even bother to shower, slung on his coat and grabbed a tie. Within 5 minutes, he was heading up the Miserbont bypass, driving with one hand and operating his battery-powered shaver with the other. By the time he got to Plas Wern Las, the photography and fingerprint boys were crawling all over the place. He ducked under the police tape to find Harry Warden looking as spruce as ever in a different 3-button black suit and hair newly gelled, talking with a woman whom he recognized immediately. This time, Jane Merriam was casually dressed in jeans and a check jacket, with an immaculate white blouse lending an extra touch of style. Her silver grey hair was cut shorter, almost a bob, and on the hand she held towards him as he came through the entranceway was a large turquoise ring. He took the hand and shook it. It felt cold. You know each other? Harry Warden asked as Gwendraeth came closer. We've met, Jane Merriam said. Her voice didn't give away anything. I've asked the others to stay in the kitchen while we deal with the body. Harry Warden scratched his head as he spoke and then examined his fingers for gel traces. He didn't appear to find any. I went to London, Gwendraeth James reminded his sergeant. To Jane Merriam's flat. I arrived this morning on the train from Swansea, Jane Merriam said. Merriam was going to pick me up, but then this happened. So she sent David Young. They're all in there now. Harry Warden nodded his head towards the kitchen. Marian's not dead? Gwendraeth asked. He knew he was being blunt, but he couldn't help himself. Sorry, Chief. It's Queenie Rogers, Harry Warden said, letting Gwendraeth squeeze past. It was a depressing sight, as Gwendraeth knew it had to be. If anything, the gruesome nature of the murder was enhanced by the easy elegance of the high-ceilinged room. This morning it was flooded with light from the large, well-proportioned sash windows, that also served to highlight the horror of the attack. Queenie Rogers, or what was left of her, lay at an odd angle in a pool of blood. Her bloody, bashed-in head was twisted back at an extraordinary angle, and her staring eyes would stay with him far longer than he wanted them to. Time of death, Gwendraeth said automatically to Aneurin Howells, who, wearing a protective suit over his usual sports jacket and fawn trousers, was kneeling down to one side of the body. Give me a chance, Gwendraeth, Aneurin Howells said. I've only just got here myself. Gwendraeth didn't say anything more for a while, just watched as the photographers finished their work, taking shots of the scene from every conceivable angle. Aneurin Howells stood up to let them continue. The fingerprint boys were already closing up their cases. Those also serve who only stand and wait, Aneurin Howells said to Gwendraeth as he stood by his side. What? Milton, on his blindness, Aneurin Howells said. What's the matter with you, Gwendraeth? Went to a good school, didn't you? St. Illtyd's. Was only a day boy. Nothing wrong with that. I was a boarder there myself. You were lucky. You missed the bad food and the buggery. Buggery? Gwendraeth said. Never thought about it. It was trying to be a minor public school, Aneurin Howells said. Of course there was buggery. Gwendraeth considered this for a minute. She didn't say anything. Thought you were the underprivileged, did you? Aneurin Howells continued. Perhaps you'd better think again. Standing there in the bare 18th century room, whose very elegance seemed to mock their endeavours, Gwendraeth wondered what other things he'd failed to give enough consideration to. There were probably a lot of them. But if his view of things were partial, limited by the extent of his own personality, then the least he could do was recognize the extent of his own bias. He could start there, at least. She'd been dead for a while, hadn't she? He said. A rough guess, 6 to 8 hours, Aneurin Howells said. I'll know more later and confirm the cause of death. It's obvious, isn't it? Gwendraeth said, interrupting. He didn't want to go into all the technical details. You know this is a copycat murder, Aneurin Howells said, suddenly. From what I understand, it's an exact duplication of the Henrietta James case, even down to the positioning of the murder weapon. Gwendraeth nodded. He felt suddenly weary, even though he'd only been awake for a few hours. He thought he smelled blood. It seemed to have a bitter aftertaste that he couldn't quite lose. He could have done with a drink. Let me know the exact findings as soon as you got them, he said, turning to go. You'll wait until the wagon comes. Aneurin Howells nodded. He looked pale in the morning light, Gwendraeth thought. There was a place at the bottom of his chin where he'd forgotten to shave. They were waiting for him in the kitchen when he arrived. Sitting on stools around the refectory table were Martin James, Marion Keynes, David Young, Samantha Merriam, and her mother, Jane. Gwendraeth noticed the two of them seemed to be deliberately avoiding sitting close to each other. Harry Warden stood at the far end of the room near the window. They stopped talking when Gwendraeth came in. I've asked the sergeant to gather you here for obvious reasons, Gwendraeth said. Formal statements will be taken from you later, individually. For the moment, I want to concentrate on your whereabouts last night. That includes Jane Merriam, who I understand spent the night in a hotel in Swansea. That can be verified, of course, he said, looking directly at her. Of course. It would be difficult to disturb that cultivated elegance, Gwendraeth thought. A good session in bed might do it. The suddenness of his own train of thought surprised him. She was, after all, about 20 years older than he was. He covered his distraction well. Perhaps we ought to begin with the others then. Your daughter, perhaps? Marion Keynes interrupted him. Her voice was low, deliberately controlled. "Is this strictly necessary, Inspector?" she said. "After all, you are taking statements later, and the house doesn't run by itself." "A murder has been committed in surprising circumstances," Gwendraeth said. "A brutal murder that duplicates an unsolved crime committed here over 50 years ago. Anything you contribute, now or later, may help us in our inquiries." "You're not saying we're implicated?" The question came from Samantha Merriam, who sat in the middle of the table wearing a work shirt and a black bobble hat, probably in direct contrast to her mother, Gwendraeth noticed. He avoided answering her question directly. "At this stage, we are considering anything that may be of help." "I was in my room all night, alone," Samantha continued. "I've already told the sergeant." "You want our private voices, do you?" David Young said. "You want us to make them public?" "If you've got any," Harry Warden said from the other end of the room. "Might make a change." There was a ripple of laughter that eased the atmosphere, and Gwendraeth James had to admit that for once, Harry Warden had said the right thing. "We loved Queenie," Merriam Keynes said. "We loved her despite her faults and idiosyncrasies and because of them. We hope she's already in the process of transformation." Gwendraeth tried to interrupt her, but Merriam Keynes continued. "And on the way to achieving peace." "My concentration," Gwendraeth said, deliberately breaking the mood, "must be on the immediate and on the material. Can you tell us, for example, where you were last night, Martin?" There was a noticeable tension in the room that was not just caused by Gwendraeth's question. Both men knew that the cause went deeper, back into their personal history. Martin James cleared his throat before he spoke. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I went into the Apple House about 10:30 after he'd had the evening meal." Some of the others nodded in agreement. "I tried to read for a while, but I was distracted. I got up about 12, and I went out and got into the Land Rover, and I drove up the mountain, and I pretty much stayed there all night." "So you don't have an alibi?" "I have an alibi. I was on the mountain all night." "But no one can corroborate that," Harry Warden said. "There was no one else there," Martin James admitted. "Did anyone see him leave?" Gwendraeth looked around the room. "I saw Martin around 10:30, Merriam Keynes spoke softly, but with assurance. "He left just before I went to bed. The next time I saw him was around 6 o'clock this morning, just before we discovered the body." "And you didn't see anyone or anything else afterwards?" "No." "But you can't be sure exactly what time he left?" "No." There was an attentive silence in the room as they all waited for David Young to say something. "I went outside to smoke like I always do," he said after a while. "Sometimes I see Martin if he goes for a walk or something." "But you didn't see him last night?" "No." "And you followed your usual routine?" Harry Warden had moved from his place at the window and stood near the table. "I did." "How long did you stay out?" Gwendraeth shifted his stool in an attempt to get more comfortable. "I don't know exactly. Could have been half an hour. Could have been longer." "Isn't that rather a long time for a smoke?" David Young shrugged. He was a hard man to read because he didn't respond quickly, and he didn't even look at you directly, Gwendraeth thought. "I smoke a pipe," David Young said. "I wasn't in a rush. I filled it, and then I lit it, and then I smoked it. It was a nice night." There was no more to say about that for a moment, Gwendraeth felt. He tried a different tack. "So you didn't see Martin leave?" "No. Told you. I finished the smoke, and then I went in." "Did you see anyone else?" "No." Not apart from Queenie. Queenie? She was going out. What time is this? I don't know exactly. 10:45, maybe. Isn't that a bit late to be going out? Harry Warden asked the obvious question that time, and Gwendraeth was glad to let him do it. Queenie sometimes did that, Marion Keen said. She usually took the Volvo. And no one asked her where she was going? We're adults, Inspector, Marion Keen said. This isn't an institution, and we don't pry. That was fair enough on one level, Gwendraeth thought. On another, it infuriated him. Why the hell had it taken them so long to tell him anything about Queenie's habits? In a calmer tone, he asked them that. There seemed to be a general reluctance to say much. Jane Merriam broke the ensuing silence by asking if she could leave, because she obviously couldn't throw much light on the direction the conversation was taking. Gwendraeth agreed to let her go, saying she would still have to make her statement later. Then Marion Keen spoke again. She'd obviously had time to consider what she was going to say. Queenie Rogers was fragile, Inspector. Despite her tough exterior, she was very sensitive. She could be volatile. All of us here had to learn to let her handle things in her own way. And that includes relationships. What Marion means is that Queenie only slept with men she didn't feel close to, Martin James said. One of them was me. It didn't seem to be news to any of the others, Gwendraeth guessed, gauging the atmosphere in the room as best he could. I was another, David Young said. Any other offers? Gwendraeth James said. He knew it wasn't a sensitive thing to say, but he couldn't help himself. It took Marion Keen's to remind him of the proprieties. Queenie was strictly hetero, Inspector, even if she was disturbed, Marion Keen said. And even if she hadn't been, she would have been entitled to her preferences, and so are we. Gwendraeth felt justly rebuked. He'd overstepped a remark, and partly he'd done it because he felt so out of place and impatient. He had to admit to himself that his own tendency of wanting to shake things up for the sake of it could sometimes get him into trouble. This was one of them. I apologize, he heard himself saying, if I've trodden on anyone's sensitivities. I would still like to know who Queenie Rogers was seeing and how long it had been going on. Encourage you to tell me what you know. David Young helped himself to some coffee from the machine. He tasted what was in his cup, made a face and said, a while, I think. Not that she said anything, but she went out twice a week regular over the past few months. Sounds more like an affair, Gwendraeth said. That's pretty regular for a series of one-night stands. I told you, Marion Keen said. You can't assume anything with Queenie. When she wanted, she could break all the rules. What I can assume, he said, is somebody must have heard something. A murder like this doesn't get committed in silence. So? Nothing. There was no reply. Samantha Merriam wouldn't even look at him, probably because of his previous behavior. But everyone else seemed sanguine enough. You mean to tell me, he said, knowing there was more than a trace of sarcasm in his voice, but being unable to do anything about it, that this highly sensitive, somewhat confused young woman gets butchered in her own front room and no one here hears anything? It was Marion Keen who spoke first. Queenie wasn't confused, Inspector. She looked straight at him when she said this, and she wasn't even particularly young. She was in her early 30s and old enough to know what she was doing. old enough to make her own choices, even if they weren't ones some of us particularly approved of. And not one of you has any idea who her lover was. Another silence followed. Gwendraeth glanced up at the kitchen clock on the far wall. It was still only 8:45. On a normal day, he would only just have arrived at work and probably would have been settling down to a second cup of coffee and a pile of reports. But nothing about today was normal. That was probably why he was trying to concentrate on the mechanics of things, to attempt to blot out the spreading unease that he felt about the copycat murder. He was about to dismiss them for the moment and tell them that Harry Warden and a constable would take their individual statements when Martin James spoke. I take it we're free to move then, Gwendraeth? Gwendraeth James confirmed that they were, within limits. And to consult our own solicitor, if necessary. You feel you're a suspect? You've just told me, you and your sergeant here, Martin James continued, that I don't have an alibi. And that means, of course, I'm a suspect. No one here really has an alibi, Harry Warden put in. No one actually saw anyone else after about 10:30, with the exception of David Young, who says that he saw Queenie leave, but now she's dead. Inspector? Marion Keynes took the lead once again. We'll take your individual statements as arranged, Gwendraeth James said. Then we'll take it from there. We don't even know where Queenie Rogers was actually murdered yet. You mean? Samantha Merriam spoke for the first time in a while. We mean it's possible the body was brought here, miss, Harry Warden cut in. That's why not one of you heard anything. If you didn't, that is. It was brighter a little later in the morning. Gwendraeth James took the path through the wood at the side of Plas Wern Las, past the place where they'd first interviewed Samantha Merriam, and began to climb slowly upwards. He wanted to get away from the house, at least for a while. He'd left Warden and Constable Evans, a tall, gingerous youngster with pale skin, to do the routine stuff. He wasn't expecting anything new to emerge from the statements. Before he'd left, he'd called forensics and told them to examine the blue-grey Volvo as well. It was just possible that Queenie Rogers had driven herself the night before, if what David Young had said had been correct, but that her body had been driven back by the killer and placed in the dining room while the others slept. Even so, it would have been a tricky maneuver, and the thought of it bothered him. The path narrowed as it became less used. He clambered over a fence that marked the boundary of the land that still belonged to Plas Wern Las. The woods on the other side looked neglected. Undergrowth loomed between the old oaks, and for a moment he thought about abandoning his walk. But then he could see that the path cleared again farther on, so he persisted. He stopped near a large fallen oak that lay across the path and sat on the lower part of the trunk, which was cleared of branches. When the tree had fallen, it had brought with it great gouts of root and earth, so the whole thing looked like a hobbit disaster. From the point of view where he sat, Plas Wern Las lay tucked into the fold of the landscape, an elegant but partly hidden addition. He could just see the gently sloping roof at the back of the house, and he wondered about the building's significance for so many people. Martin James, for example, had returned from London to see it after a gap of nearly 20 years. Anne Davis's mother had cherished her time there and had even bought the house skeleton in an auction. Wyndham Spencer James, Martin's second cousin, was over anxious about his lack of possession of a place that he seemed to think that was his by right. And then there was Marion Keynes, who, despite her cool exterior, was passionate enough about the place to want to restore what she saw as its spirit. After the events of last night, Gwendraeth couldn't help wondering whether she still felt the same about it. And then there were the murderers, whoever they were. Two people separated by 50 years, but joined by a common purpose: to apparently destroy the habitability of the house by linking it with a crime gruesome enough to deter all but the most determined from occupation. He wondered, despite himself, if there were anything wrong with the place, and how he was to understand its complications and compulsions.